very much. I think there's a lot of, we have hundreds of people here online. They're from all over Europe and all over Africa. So just warmly welcome all of you for joining from every part of Africa and Europe. It's really pleased to have you here. I'm now going to move on to Aya. Aya, very warm welcome to you.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us. You are, let me just say, your first ever African Union Youth Envoy. You're the chair of the Nala Feminist Collective. And what we'd like to hear from you is, you've been heavily involved in issues of young people's consultations, engagement, etc. Can you share, like I asked Franz, react to what you saw on that video and what you've heard, but also give your perspective on youth action and the scaling up of youth action from your perspective. Over to you, Aya.
Thank you so much for having me. My comments would briefly touch on 3 points: engagement, leadership, and the European Green Deal and what it means for Africa. And it seems my generation and the generation of Mr. Timmermans have different approach, because as he wants to colonize the future, I published yesterday about decolonizing the partnership. And I think this is the kind of conversation my generation is having right now, about decolonizing the Africa-Europe partnership. We should not be expecting political solutions to political problems when we feel as African youth that Europe still treats Africa as its savior and colonial master. So first, my point on meaningful youth engagement. I think we cannot host African leaders and not have young Africans in Brussels or Glasgow or elsewhere when it's hosted in European cities because of issues of mobility and vaccine equity between the 2 continents. And I'm not saying there are no young people there, but how many are young Africans who cross the Mediterranean to be there and have a decision-making power? And as we're going into African COP, the COP27 in Egypt, my appeal is to decolonize your approach, support Africa-led efforts, and fund young Africans to be in COP as part of your delegation, so they can have access to negotiations and not be there just as the activist who sits on panel or protests in the street. 2, on the issue of leadership. The issue of leadership on the continent is generational, just like the issue of development is colonial. 64 is the average age of African leaders, and 20 is the average age of Africa's population. If we want strategies to reinforce African and European youth leadership, we need to move into what I call intergenerational co-leadership. There are commendable initiatives on climate that engage young people, but mostly Europe is the host, the owner, and the donor of these initiatives. And young Africans are just invited to participate. I don't think young people are asking for participation anymore. They're asking for co-leadership, co-creation, co-designing the decisions, and resources to implement those decisions. So why don't we enforce a 35% to be youth institutionalized in the negotiation rooms in every COP and every AU summit? And that was our recommendation yesterday in our event as Nala Feminist Collective. And then my final comment is on the Green Deal. Some called AU green intervention in Africa also a green colonialism. And honestly, as an African, I ask, what does the Green Deal mean for Africa? Because it looks like the Green Deal is pretending to save the climate while it's actually saving the European economy. As now it moved from green transition, we're talking about green recovery. And since the European EVP for Green Deal is with us, I'm glad you mentioned electricity. I'd like to hear your thoughts on President Macky Sall's concern over natural gas. Europe knows natural gas is needed, yet doesn't want African countries to produce that gas. And as you said, even though Africa accounts for only 3% of the world's carbon emissions, so is Europe imposing foreign policy at the expense of Africa's own development aspiration? I think African youth would be really interested to hear your thoughts on that, Mr. Timmermans. Thank you.
Aya, wow, what a powerful set of statements. And I can see that, on the chat, you sent the chat whizzing, and you powerfully conveyed some of the points that are really very kind of cutting, if I may say, to the heart of some of the relationship issues. On your last point, very briefly, because I have a number of speakers to get to, but you've made a very powerful gong there, is the thing about gas. So let's turn backwards from that. We know that gas is bad. And we know that the Commission has said there are some elements of energy that have to continue as a part of the transition. What would you like as an alternative? Because you know that if you go down the pathway of gas, there may be some very powerful consequences for the continent. Is there not an alternative way? I mean, I know you're not an expert on this, but you're asking, do you have an alternative solution? Is it just to let Africa get on with gas?
Yeah, but again, Africa accounts for 3% of the world's carbon emissions. So let's not pretend that Africa is the problem here. Instead of challenging Africa over its development priorities, Europe should be accountable to its historical contribution to global warming pollution.
Okay.
And if Europe actually reaches the ambition targets put for itself, I think the problem would be solved. But the question is, will Europe reach the targets?
Okay, I'm sure, colleagues, those of you who are, active, please do react to what you've heard. Disagree, have alternatives, have recommendations, because we document all that you're saying on the Zoom chat, and it's important, and we'll play that back both to leaders into the Africa EU summit next week, but also for posterity in terms of actions. So I do encourage you to use the Zoom chat, and if you do want to come in, use your virtual hand and raise it so that my colleagues can alert me to who I can bring in. I'm going to move directly to.